thank you so much for inviting me here and for having the opportunity to see Belgrade, actually, a little bit at least, and also to talk and discuss with the other two people of this morning, like the one across me. so this is great. Yes, in fact, I will present to you some thoughts I have about the human enhancement debate from a philosophical point of view. And if I say so from the philosophical, I'm mostly concerned about meaning. And so I want to simply acknowledge at first that the comparative form of good is better, of better, best. With these comparative forms, we can measure and label different grades or scales, same grade, unequal grade, higher, or the highest grade of a property or criteria. Good, better, best. My question is, these possibilities of comparison are part of our everyday language. But what do they actually mean? More precisely, what does the conception of comparability, of progress, improvement, enhancement mean for the body and life? Better bodies, best lives? What is wrong with the focus on the medical technological enhancement of human bodies for a good, better, best life? Today, the concept of better bodies involved biotechnological interventions. Not sports, that is physical exercise or healthy nutrition, but genetic, neurological or pharmaceutical interventions in the materiality of the body now offer the promise of functional enhancement, of bettering. In debates in the 1980s, a distinction was still made in genetic therapy between somatic interventions, that is, those concerning the individual, and intervention in the germline, and above all, a clear distinction was also made between therapy and enhancement. The goal of therapy was considered to be the cautious and restrained cure and healing of illnesses or defects, and hence serve to promote health. Genetically bettered, enhanced body functions were socially and politically controversial. Moreover, they were considered to be medically unsafe and morally wrong. The goal of medicine was to restore the health of an individual and not to make an individual better than healthy. And it was precisely this that changed at the turn of the century. The President's Council of Bioethics in 2003, initiated by then President George Bush, actually the one we had heard about today already, discussed enhancement as a central option and narrowed the normative discussion to a substantialized human nature and its protection. Under the heading Biotherapy, Biotechnology and Pursuit of Happiness, the report provided a large picture of biotechnology. All biotechnological interventions for the enhancement of human beings, that is, making them better than well, were to be evaluated in a larger frame. The larger frame is solely based on the apparently similar purpose of cosmetic surgery, cochlear implants, so hearing aids implanted, genetic manipulation, or pharmaceutical stimulants in enhancement bodily function. The title, Biotherapy, refers to those interventions that are desired by the patient for themselves or for their children and that are understood as improvement of enhancement. And I quote from this book, "For these reasons, we confine our attention to those well-meaning and strictly voluntary uses of biomedical technology through which the user is seeking some improvement or augmentation of his or her own capacities, or from similar benevolent motives of those of his or her children. Such use of biotechnological powers to pursue improvements or perfections, whether of body, mind, performance, or sense of well-being is at all once both the most seductive and the most disquieting temptation. End of quote. This biotechnical application so is both unsettling and tempting because it reflects, and I would even here add historically since a long time, humankind's deep dissatisfaction with natural limits and its ardent desire to overcome them. It also embodies what is genuinely novel and worrisome in the biotechnological revolution beyond the so-called life issues of abortion and embryo destruction, important though they are. What is at issue, I quote, is not the crude old power to kill the creature made in God's image, but the attractive science-based power to remake ourselves after images of our own devising. As a result, it gives unexpected practical urgency to ancient philosophical questions. What is a good life? So this is a sort of a background of a discussion, I think, which we in some sense still have. This bioconservative position, you were also referring to this notion, and I guess it's a one common notion, is about the recognition and protection of a, perhaps in parentheses, divine human nature as a gift and a source of meaning and goodness of life. To improve, it would be not only morally wrong, but also a blasphemy. There are 2 points at issue here, and one of which is about human nature as a basis and a source of good life, and the other is about enhancement as a treatment, that is, being allowed or wanting to make a person better in the sense of better than normal, better than healthy. The goal is no longer restoring mere health, the goal is improving human nature as manifested in the individual human body. The body with its qualities and functions is the foundation for a best life. So in the first part now, which follows, I will discuss the notion of human nature as a basis and source of life, and the human nature as a body and in the context of these demands. And in the second part coming up, I will try to reformulate the question of the relationship between enhancement in the good life on the basis of what I call the human condition or a way of living, and try to expand away from what I already in the morning in the discussion called a sort of individualism. So to the first part, human nature is the basis and source of good life, but the body. The bioethicist, we had heard the name already, John Harris, argues that there is a moral obligation for enhancement. The term enhancement is used by him in the sense of improvement, that is, the improvement of an individual's previous state. I cite, if it wasn't good for you, it wouldn't be enhancement. End of quote. Who could argue with this? If there is a possibility to create a healthier, longer living and better individual, then there are only rational reasons for doing this. So the position by Harris. He argues for this thesis as following. Enhancements are so obviously good for us, if there weren't, there wouldn't be enhancement. That is, it is odd that the idea of enhancement has caused, in still occasions, so much suspicion, fear, and outright hostility. So he said, wrote into 2009. This obviously circular argument simply begs the question. Since enhancement has already been defined as improvement, of course, everything that does not improve is also enhancement. This equation of enhancement and improvement is at first sight a clever move meant to checkmate the supposed opponents of enhancement technologies. The equation of description and valuation, however, disguises the fact that technical modification of a body whose changeable nature is undefined or controversial for both the individual and society, goes unnamed and so is excluded from discussion as if it did not exist. But enhancement should not be understood as simply improvement, as it is also involves irreversible technological changes. This raises the question, enhancement for whom? Technological changes for what? What are the fundamental assumptions being made in the discourse around enhancement? Traditionally, the category of human nature was used in a dualistic conception to draw a boundary between humans and animals. The widespread understanding of human nature that since antiquity to Kant and beyond was defined humans as zoon logon echon, being with language, beings, of course, plural, huh? Important. Beings with language and reason, or as animal rational, prepared the ground for a species term to human. So this move from the zoon logon echon then to the animal rational is sort of prepared this kind of species term human. This understanding of human nature leads by way of evolutionary biology from culturalist, psychological and philosophical to natural science and genetic conceptions of humankind. And now I would want to present to you the following then this gradualist view which comes out of it. An alternative now to the strict dualism between humans and animals was formulated at the end of the 20th century by Peter Singer and then John Harris and Julian Savulescu and Ingmar Petersen and others with their controversial thesis there is only a gradual difference between human and non-human beings, between more or less livable lives, between more or less rational, intelligent beings, and more or less good changes for a good life. All three of the authors named above share the view that species membership does not imply a particular right to protection. This has consequences for the field of research into reproduction. Harris and Savulescu and others advance the thesis that parents should decide in favor of, I quote, stronger, smarter, nicer humans and should abort less promising embryos. So, enter. Using criteria such as rationality or pain sensation, living things are categorized as more or less valuable, or alive as more or less valuable. It is then not only about sorting out embryos with a high genetic risk or severe diseases, but also about optimizing selection and augmenting capacities and qualities. Behind this stance are the following basic assumptions. First, a body is in principle divisible. Its parts are responsible for qualities or functions. Second, a well-functioning body is the basis for a good life. There is a correlation between well-functioning and a good life, between better functioning and a better life. Functions are essentially considered separately and not in the relationship to other functions or in the social context. This scenario of selection and optimization can only be defended if a hierarchization of the value good is accepted and if the norm of a dividing line between species is rejected, that is, if a gradualist approach to the nature of living things is adopted. This background argumentation implies that if creatures are another species can be killed without moral obligations and modified by performance-enhancing methods or reproduction engineering interventions, then there is no principled objection to doing the same thing to humans. The human being becomes an optimized machine. Savulescu and others, seemingly untouched by historical knowledge, recommends selecting embryos with the best quality, namely those embryos that have the best chance of developing into a child with a best life. Parents thus have the obligation to select an embryo with the chance of having a best life. By best life, quote, I will understand the life with the most well-being. We have, therefore, a moral obligation to test for genetic contribution to non-disease states, such as intelligence, and to use this information in reproductive decision-making. Savulescu placed down the obligation to attain the genetically best outcome with the laconic term procreative beneficence, or some uses. Couples, I quote, or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have who is expected to have the best life, or at least as good a life as the others, based on the relevant available information. So genetic data or information. Relevant information can conceivably be found about severe genetic disabilities, but in the case of positive selection of desirable qualities, it would be necessary to be able to and to want to plan in detail the life of a future person in order to determine what information is relevant. This means the list of assumptions is going to be longer. First, the body is not only divisible in principle, moreover, precisely the parts, the qualities, the functions, the genes are to be transformed into plannable data. Second, humans must think of themselves and others, children for example, as bodily substrates and in principle as viable and modifiable. If sports, disciplining or cultural practices was once the main method for modifying body and mind, now it is technological intervention. This happens beneath the level of culture and in the materiality of the body that seems to be as modifiable as representational nature. So here the rule of environment, so third presumption, the rule of environment is ignored and remains unchanged. Fourth, the value of life is in principle gradable. In other words, but in the same logic, a good life can always be made better, optimized, and so it is never good enough. And fifth, the best life can be desired and is desirable, it can be attained, and it is worth attaining. This approach thus claims that the capacity for love for intelligence is plannable like a cake recipe. Actually, that was in the morning. There was also this reference to recipe in the kitchen you made, yeah. And for the future, so this love for intelligence is plannable, and for the future can be predetermined, pre-selected, or pre-improved. It is listed a number of specific qualities like intelligence is always there, and memory. And then one example used here by Savulescu is like not forgetting baby food in the supermarket. And not to do this helps to lead a good life. Yeah. What is wrong here? Equality, for example, intelligence, is being suggestively played with, even though this quality cannot be described in general terms, since it can only be developed and can only appear in a particular environment and in a particular context of relationships. So it seems the case that someone who is witty and intelligent, who enjoys literary allusions and hopes to find a happy relationship in a, for instance, purely mathematical-oriented context, will fail miserably. Or presumably such tough and clever banker, number one in the Forbes list, would pretty much remain an outsider in an artistic milieu. So one has to look context. Savulescu clearly simplifies his example and is fundamentally mistaken if he believes that a certain kind of good life can be obtained by means of certain qualities. This misconception does not only include the thesis that qualities can be selected on the basis of genetic dispositions, but also that certain qualities promise a certain life. It is evident that a tall person is happier than a short one. Are genes associated with intelligence really the key to good living and a good life? Are we certain that we want to abort an embryo with a genetic disposition to asthma? Will the child with the highest intelligence quotient have the best life? How should qualities be hierarchized? Which quality, beauty or intelligence, would offset each other in the assessment of scale, and why? My intention is not to condemn genetic medicine in principle. Instead, I am concerned to dismiss the overly simplified view that enhancing a set of functions and qualities will lead to a better life, and I am calling for more nuanced discussion to clarify what possibly enhancement might have to contribute to a good life. And with this, I'd like to turn to my second part about reformulating the question a little bit. Even though the above argumentation advocates the enhancement of qualities of function has been exposed as little convincing or as too simplistic, the question still remains as to whether the enhancement of bodies could lead to a better best life. The question of the better life first requires precisely determining what should be considered as desirable. After all, whoever is striving for a good life is interested in more than merely surviving. The areas of life most associated with the chance for a good life are, according to Martha Nussbaum in a recent publication 210, mortality, health and education. Whereas therapy is seen as primarily related to health and its restoration, enhancement potentiality affects every aspect of life. Discussions about the possibilities and hopes of modern technological medicine involve thinking in the future and planning for the future. The broad field of individual capacity enhancement is always about the idea and wishes of a future life. A commonly cited example, and some of you will know this, involves two American 11-year-old boys whose maximum height is predicted to be about 165 centimeters only. So America, no? People are tall there. One of the boys has a growth hormone deficiency, while the other's predicted height is due to his short parents. Both are prescribed a growth hormone treatment, but these decisions are based on very different criteria. One is missing a particular hormone. The other has a genetic disposition for a particular height because of short parents, right? But both parents would like their offspring to be taller. They believe that being taller will give them a better chance not only in sports but in society in general. Both parents would like their children to be taller. Both have particular desires which are, however, strongly influenced by their social context. If the parents who have passed on their relatively short height lived in a different society, then they might not even have had the idea that their child needs to be enhanced. This everyday story is about ideas about society with desires related to parental pride and childhood success, and with attitudes about the changeability of given conditions. The parents think that being tall is a central criteria for success, and their boys need to fulfill this standard. Stories and decisions like this take place in a given society and a particular context. decisions about enhancement would probably be different if the social condition, the cultural context were different. Ideas of what is better and desires for enhancement are formed within a given social context, which must be taken into account when considering whether enhancement decisions are appropriate. What should be accounted for? It seems absurd to infer that a better life would follow just from enhancing human capacities. This was for the reason that, as already mentioned above, physical capacities and dispositions first develop in a particular context and in the interaction between humans and the environment. There is a good reason for the distinction in phenomenology between the material body and the sentient body. If the body is, following the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, understood as a hinge to the world and as an anchorage in the world, then the bodily function, that is particular feelings, sensory perceptions, memory or movements, can only be understood in interaction with the world. Only if the body is understood as being sensitive, affectable and vulnerable does it have a meaning. Physicality, corporality, but also natality, mortality, vulnerability, sexuality, the need for relationships, are all aspects of the conditio humana, so the human condition. In the sense of the conditionality and constitution of human beings and human interrelationships, I hold them to be the basis and the source of a good life. The human condition, as Hannah Arendt, the philosopher and political theorist Hannah Arendt, made very clear in her book Vita Activa, consists of both conditions that are pre-given and already found, as well as those that are formed and shaped by humans. The structure of the human condition seems to be pre-given, but yet the materiality and technologicality, the narratively and symbolically, culturally and socially, it is formed, shaped and experienced in everyday life and in different ways. So that is this very structure human beings have, that they are born, that they have a natality, that they are mortal, gives already the basic structure, and then it's a question how we actually give meaning to it as human beings in their different plural ways. It is concretely experienced, so the structure, in different ways and forms. And this concrete fundamental experience opens up questions such as, how is your life? How do you live? Do you have a good life? How do we experience the fundamental condition of our own life, your own body, or your own mental constitution, or relationships? How are they realized in life? That is, how does bodily constitution find expression and participation in the lived experience in the world with others? In disability studies, the term impairment is used not without a good reason, so it has good reasons that it's used that way. It indicates that the environment can also be more or less a hindrance. Wheelchairs access to buildings is one aspect. The textualization of acoustic information for the deaf and hearing impaired is another. The particular condition depends then on bodily experience as well as on the bodily potentiality and interpersonal, social and material relationships. An improvement in life means also an improvement in life as it is lived and experienced. The experience of bodily capacities in harmony with a particular context, or the experience of one's own qualities, whether seen as positive or favorable in the social context, determines the experience of happiness or unhappiness, or the experience of lived life. Experience refers, as the philosopher Ursula Wolff suggests, in reference to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, to the way of living. The question is to the good life and its enhancement is not a question about a hedonistic conception of happiness, but a question as to how someone, me or you, can and should live in a meaningful way. Even so, this question cannot, strictly speaking, be answered for anyone else. It is, however, often enough to ask for others. A good life is a meaningful life. However, it is possibly impossible to gain full insight into one's own life, much less into the life of another. That is why we can only speak of a meaningful way of living and meaningful decisions corresponding to the way of living, whether it is about one's own way of living, about bodily or environmental changes. But meaning, especially meaning for oneself, is created in a complex of relationships. It is in particular context that meaning can be experienced. To this extent, the best way of living is always in a good and flourishing way of living, namely one that is appropriately flourishing and a meaningful harmony with oneself and with others. From the perspective of Ursula Wolf, it is important to discuss the question about the good life or the flourishing life of a living without any precondition. If, for instance, John Harry states that disability cannot be desirable, then he formulates this thesis from the viewpoint of someone who is not disabled. Certainly, spontaneously, I think we can agree that certain disabilities are definitely not desirable. I mean, I wouldn't like to be disabled in certain ways. However, the whole experience, what disability means, and the experience of disability is completely excluded in this discussion, since the descriptive perspective is selected from the very beginning in favor of non-disability. So this kind of idea what it means to be normal. We ask about, or better, we ask about the comparison good, better, and best. I argued above for the thesis that the best life for me is always and only the good life, as meaning is experienced from an interior bodily spiritual perspective as part of a way of living. An experience or decision can only be more or less meaningful in relation to my way of living. How can a decision be made about enhancement now? Based on individual capacities and qualities, or based on relationships and conditions? In this context, it cannot only be the question of an obligation to enhance functions. The more meaningful question is what is advisable in a particular context and for a particular way of living. Advisability, the prudent version of normativity, is what is required. What is advisable for those who will be possibly affected in their experience and in their social context. I might be interested in using memory aids, but not in being able to run faster. I mean, this would be my choice. Memory is better than running faster, huh? In academia, we might think of focus-enhancing drugs. A model might dream of skin tightening. Members of a deaf community might, however, reject, as it is actually done, reject cochlear implants for children. But this rejection was also done because the first models of cochlear implants were pretty lousy. They made some extra noises. However, so this is somehow always looking at this precise context. But from a social perspective, some of these practices might be unadvisable or inappropriate at all. When we ask about the good life, then we are talking about ethics, namely a future ethics. Should the enhancement of humans be pursued, or an enhancement of interpersonal and worldly relations? Proponents of enhancement and creative beneficence argue for the former, losing sight of the implicit assumptions of the conception of the body as well as the fundamental body-soul experience of those potentially affected as well, and of the conditions and constitution of the environment and interpersonal relations, which on the one hand are implicitly assumed and on the other hand are changed through technological and medical enhancement practices. That is, the reason why an ethics of the good life must refrain from simple quantitative comparison of a better or best life and instead defend a qualitative, meaningful life from the perspective of the individuals affected by an enhancement decision in the light of their way of living and in the light of their specific social context. As for example, questions, following question, and here I will come to the end, questions could be asked, what pressure actually do the experts of a modern and technological sophisticated medicine exert on potential or actual individuals? Who needs or wants perfect health or performance enhancement, or what is a price? So not just money, all sorts of prices. Which social questions are implied in a decision for or against a certain diagnosis, therapy, or enhancement treatment? So I opt for the social. Thank you. And now we have to bring it all together.